and I. Please respect the time restriction. I will let you know when you have 5 minutes left and 1 minute left. So the first presentation paper is entitled The Implementation of Sustainable New Business Models for Energy Provider, a case study of ENGIE's district heating and cooling system. It's written by Johanna Ayrault, Franck, Aggeri, Elodie Cadre, and Anne Prieur-Vernat, and which will be presented by Johanna. Johanna, you can share your...
Yeah, sure. I start sharing. Okay, do you see it full screen? Yeah, okay. So like it was said before, I'm Johanna Ayrault, and I'm in fact a PhD student at ENGIE and also at the management lab of the Mines Paris School. And today we'll be talking about the implementation of sustainable new business models with the case study of district heating systems. Before going to the presentation, I will just do a small reminder of what is a district heating. I mean, maybe there are some specialists here today, but well, just a short reminder. So a district heating is composed of one or several production units, for heat production units, I mean, that are connected to a distribution system. And the legal form of district heating usually just stops at the end of the building where there is an ETS, energy transfer station, that transfer the heat to the secondary network inside the building. So you have the district heating goes from the production units to the end to the building, but does not go inside the building. And here for the presentation, I will just focus on the public-owned district heating that are operated by a private operator. So first, a bit of context so that you understand why I'm studying sustainable business models and district heating, etc. So the first thing you need to know that there is a change in the client's demand. Like many cities, universities, countries, etc., are committed to net carbon neutrality goals, and they are trying to design their roadmaps for transition. And inside these roadmaps, heat can play really a big part in the decarbonation, because for now there is really a lot of district heating that are fueled by coal or gas or like fossil fuels. And due to this wish for decarbonation, there is the historical private operators that have their role changing. They are no longer just someone that are operating the network, but they are really a stakeholder in this decarbonation and in this transition. And that's partly because they have a lot of expertise and competences in the operation of these networks, and they know how to integrate more renewable energies, so they can become advisor to these cities, universities and countries to help them build their roadmap for transition. And usually the first answer for these new demands is a kind of technical answer with the integration of more renewable and recovery heat, with the use of smart networks that are better monitored and that are more efficient, with the use of storage, etc. But what is seen is that all these technical pieces are not enough to really conduct a major change. And it's because they demand new ways of organizing the collective action. They demand new governance tools as they integrate new stakeholders inside the network. Because the ones that are owning the biomass units or that are owning the heat solar heat units are not necessarily the same ones as the historical ones. And also these new demands of carbon transition, etc. It changes a bit the value proposition. It's not only about delivering heat, it's about delivering a kind of social and environmental performance too. So changing the business model is kind of the core of changing, changing the value proposition is kind of the core of changing the business model. That's why I'm studying business models. Just to do a short focus on ENGIE's position. ENGIE is a kind of major heat delivery operator. They're operating a lot of district heating and district cooling around the world. And now they're trying to reconfigure their position in this all sustainable transition context. So it has, since 2019, a new purpose that is about accelerating transition towards a carbon neutral economy and reducing energy consumption, having more environmental friendly solutions, etc. So really on these different aspects of transition that I've mentioned before. And also it is committed to net zero carbon for 2045 with scope 3, so including their clients' emissions. So all these strategies goes towards the transition for its clients and not only for ENGIE. And one way of encouraging this transition is the district heating and cooling systems. And in particular, ENGIE is trying to really help the neutrality road of district heating and the decarbonation of the public utilities. And like I said before, it means a new value propositions and it means a new business model. So just the business model, like I said, it's mainly about value proposition, but also about the whole value process. So value proposition, value creation, value delivery, value capture. And here in this slide, you can find various definitions of business model. And what I want to point out is that the backbone of all definition is really the value process. And that's why I'm making this link between changing the context and the value proposition and changing the business model. And here in my presentation, I'm using the RTOD framework. It's kind of formalization of the business model that was proposed by DeMille and Lecoq in 2010. And it's based upon the idea that the business model is a kind of interaction between three pillars: the value proposition, the resources and competences needed, and the internal and external organization. And the idea is that when you change one of these pillars, you will have an effect on the other two. And the role of a leader is to find an equilibrium between the three pillars and to react to all the internal or external changes that can happen on one of the pillars. And I mean that today, I think we're in the middle of a transition because due to an external demand, the value proposition is changing for low carbon district heating and cooling systems. And thus the other two pillars are readapting to. So for instance, for the external organization, I was talking about the integration of new stakeholders. So there is this whole multi-stakeholder network to be governed. And due to this external change, the internal organization of the company is changing too, to really adapt and to have the right organization to answer to these new stakeholders. And of course, it demands changes in the resources and competences. Like an example is a focus made on co-construction and local encourage with the commitment of stakeholders and things like that, and building new tools and trying to really understand the local stakeholders, the local resources, and to do solutions that are tailored to a specific local context. So yeah, quickly my literature review. So like I said, the first part is on business models. So I will not go into the details anymore, but just the main points is centered on value. And so there is a whole importance of the evaluation process. And for my presentation, I'm using the SEBI framework. Then there is, of course, the object I will be studying, that is the district heating. And the main approach of district heating for now is more technical economic approach. But this approach does not really integrate the evaluation of social or environmental aspects, which are quite important for a sustainable transition. And also there is not a lot of literature on the governance of collective action, which is necessary for the integration of new stakeholders, like I mentioned before. And so there are some authors like Leroux that really point out the importance of studying all the non-technical elements, including the business model. And to really do so, I will introduce a kind of third literature. And this literature is on instruments and management tools. So it will be a kind of analysis tool to really get into the business model and to understand the way it is designed and the way it can affect practices. So one element of interest, one instrument of interest, sorry, is the contract, because it really formalizes part of the business model. So now, based on this literature review and in the context I've mentioned before, I will try to formalize my framework of analysis. So it's just to put together the various elements I've presented so far. There are three dimensions that I think of particular interest when studying a sustainable transition for kind of public utilities. The first one is the valuation process. So that I've kind of detailed this already. But yeah, it's about the value creation, proposition, capture, delivery, etc. The second one is the collective action governance. So this dimension is really related to the multi-stakeholders aspect of innovative district heating with the integration of new stakeholders, the reconfiguration of the place of historical ones, going from just operators to kind of advisors. And so there is a need to govern this new stakeholders network. And the last dimension is the design of instruments and management tools. So that is, it's what I've introduced just before in my literature review with the third literature. And the idea is that to do the first two dimensions, you need to design new instruments and new management tools that will help govern the network, that will help evaluate the different aspects you want to take into account. And the idea is that these three dimensions, they're really impacting the pillars of the business model, which are value proposition, resources and competencies, and external and internal organization. So that is the link between the framework and the kind of RCOV formalization of business model. Okay, so now I finally arrived to kind of programmatization. Like I said, ENGIE is launching its new strategy, and it is now in a phase of operationalization of its strategy. So there is a tension between the strategic intent, which is really its global strategy of decarbonation, and the practices inside the company for at the scale of a project, which is not really reconfigured for now, and they are doing the business as usual in a way. So to really study this tension and to try to reduce it, I think it's really important to see the management tools and like the dashboards people are using, etc. To try to understand and fill the gaps. So the kind of global problematic can be, how can ENGIE align its operational business model with its strategy? And to study it, I've used kind of classical qualitative research methodology with literature review and with several semi-directive interviews within ENGIE and also outside ENGIE. So, sorry. So we'll just quickly present two case studies that I've based my analysis upon. They are both French historical district heating that were pioneering the integration of renewable or recovery heat. The first one is Dunkirk, like CUD, it's Community Urbaine de Dunkerque. And you can find here some of its characteristics. So it's kind of a classical concession that is long. There is just 6 years left, but it was since 1986, so quite a long concession. They use recovery heat for 65%, and that was a choice from the beginning because they wanted to get rid of the fossil fuel price variations. But one problem is that as the fossil fuels were quite not expensive during the last year, they really had an economic weakness because they were not competitive. And working with industrial to recover heat is difficult because the industrial process always comes first. So there are some governance issues here. And the last point is that there was a huge part of the public authority that was trying to manage all this network, but had really low competences as they always used external stakeholders to manage the network. The second one is Besançon. Here, the situation is quite different because it's an older network dating from 1968. And the integration of renewable resources came later. It was not a choice from the beginning. It was a choice in the beginning of the 21st century, like 2006 and 2006 or in 2013. And it was this idea of using a local renewable energy, which is biomass, because it's a region where there is a lot of forests and a lot of biomass. And also they use waste heat from a waste incinerator. And here it's a different type of contract that are just during 6 years, and there is a renewal every 6 years, so really short-term contracts. And here again, there are some points that stands out. The first one is that the request for proposal is really demanding, and they try to lower the price of the heat. So it's kind of difficult to find an economic equilibrium. And there is a lot of support from the technical public authority is really committed to the network, and the man that is in charge of that really knows perfectly its network and is really committed. So it can cause some difficulties to discuss sometimes because he feels like he knows everything about its network, and he's not supported by his whole hierarchy. So kind of difficult. And also it was interesting for the local benefits, as it's really structured all the biomass process and industry. And so thanks to these case studies and the different interviews I've made, I've kind of pointed out some components of the 3 dimensions I've presented before. So these components, they're really critical points to be designed when trying to do a sustainable district heating and a sustainable business model. So the first one is valuation process, governance process, and contractual process. And so we'll go through first the valuation process. So here, the value proposition is really the strategic intent. So what the project wants to deliver, and usually for this kind of project, there is an agreement on the results. Then there is this idea of value creation. How do you deliver this proposition, and what reconfigurations are needed? So for that, there is the kind of responsibility of the operator to deliver results and to choose the right technical solutions to be able to deliver these results. Then there is the value capture. So how do you get some money and how do you find an economic equilibrium? So usually there are some payments depending on the results. And the last one is the value sharing, which is not part of the literature review, but for sustainable district heating is kind of important because it's multi-stakeholders. You need to see how to integrate the stakeholders in value sharing. So that's, of course, the sharing with other stakeholders and this idea of continual improvement. So put back all that the money you've created inside your system to really enhance your system. So that's for the valuation process. Then there is the governance process. So I will just go quickly through that. The first one is to really involve early the stakeholders to do a kind of co-construction of what you want to take into account into your network. Then the value creation with all this reorganization I was talking about before. The value capture, that's about the reconfiguration of the legal frame, because for now it's kind of difficult for instance, for a private operator to be advisor of the public authority before the request for proposal. So there is a kind of public market frame that is quite tight, that does not allow mutual benefits, not easily at least. And then the value sharing with what I said before, the integration of the stakeholder network and the integration to local strategies to really redistribute the value. And for the instruments, I will just go through the contractual process because it really formalizes part of the business model. And the contractual process goes from the design of the request for proposal until the signature of the final contract. And it's composed of several actions of interest, which are not neutral, but really meaningful for the future of the network. So the first one is the framing of the demand. That's, like I said before, which value do you want to take into account? How do you calculate the environmental value? How do you calculate the social value? And how do you put it into your request for proposal or into your contract? Then there is the whole part of financing, sharing the responsibilities, the risks, and the investments, because you have a multi-stakeholder network and every one of the stakeholders needs to bear part of the risks and investments. Otherwise, they won't be committed and they won't be in equilibrium. Then there is, of course, the pricing and how do you know when you will be when you will get your payments, because it's an agreement on the results. So you need to be careful on which results you want to reach. And of course, the sharing of benefits. And that's what's interesting is you can do multiple contracts and you have to integrate all these multiple contracts in a kind of cascade of or network of contracts to really have more than just the usual public service delegation between the private and the public companies, but really all the stakeholders, including the suppliers, including the workers, like everyone have a contract and is part of this network. So now we're to my conclusion. So first, like I said, I will just come back to the beginning of my presentation. There is this kind of new climate demand that is leading to a new value proposition and to the reconfiguration of the historical stakeholder network. And in this context, I try to point out 3 dimensions of interest: the valuation process, with the kind of framing of the value through co-construction, the collective action governance, with the integration of multiple stakeholders to deliver the right value, and the contractual process for the framing of the proposition, the sharing of risk, responsibilities, and investments and benefits. And these 3 dimensions, they really move the pillars of the business model framework that was proposed by Demel and Lecoq, like value proposition, resources and competencies, organization. And in particular, it demands really new resources and competences. And I have not really highlighted this point in this presentation, but I think it's really an important point that could be really interesting to study more in depth in future research. So thank you for your attention, and if you have questions, please feel free. And here there are some references if you want. It will be available online, of course.
Thank you, Johanna. Does anyone have any question?
Yes, if I may. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I was wondering. In the end, you suggest there's need for new competences. Can you be more specific about what specific competences are needed or with priority?
Yeah, sure. I think these new competencies, they are really in this idea of co-construction and integrating stakeholders. For instance, in ENGIE, they are trying to design new tools to really kind of, how do you say that? For all these stakeholders engagements, and they are trying to build like maps where you can see all the stakeholders and all the resources of a territory, of a local place, to really see the interactions between the stakeholders and to see where to fit in this already existing network. There is really a focus on local anchorage, and they are trying to find the competencies to be relevant in this specific aspect. Because, you know, ENGIE is a kind of international company, so they don't know every specific context where they are answering the request for proposal. And now they're really highlighting this aspect that they can understand the local context and they can base their solutions on the already existing network and on the already existing resources and really adapt to this context. And for that, they don't have the tools yet, because for now it was kind of a plugin. You know, you put a big gas boiler and you do the connections and that's it. And it's not the case anymore. So there is this whole local encouraged competences, let's say.
Any other question? No? Okay, thank you, Johanna, for your presentation. We will pass to the second paper, which is entitled Energy Community, Identity and Scale Orientation. It's written by Anne-Lorène Vernay, Marc Olsthoorn, Caroline Gauthier, and Carine SEBI, and which will be presented by Marc of Grenoble Ecole de Management.
Yes, that's correct. Thanks. So I assume you can now see my screen and slides. Yes, all good. Okay. So yes, I'll be presenting work I'm doing with these other 3 ladies, Anne-Lorène Vernay, Caroline Gauthier, and Carine SEBI, colleagues at Grenoble Ecole de Management. And this is about energy communities, and more specifically about their the relation between community identity and skill orientation. Okay, so to sketch the context, you've probably heard of renewable energy communities. They're everywhere, and there's thought to be a key component, could be a key component of energy transition. So in Europe, there are over 1,500. In France, where we are, there are over 200. In Germany, there are many more. It's basically the hotspot of energy communities. And these are originally bottom-up social innovations that try to produce renewable energy that is citizen-owned, so by citizens and for citizens, you could say. And now they're also part of official policies, like they feature in the European Commission's policies and strategies. So they're facilitated top-down as a component of transition policies. However, these renewable energy communities, you can say it's an alternative form of organization in the energy sector, and these often fail to scale up. So both individually, they remain rather small, and as a movement, it's growing, but still they make up only a tiny fraction of renewable energy investments. So there are barriers to scaling up, both exogenous and endogenous. So exogenous means that they're very dependent on the policy context. So to which extent renewable energies are supported for financial reasons, of course, but also regulatory, to the facilitation to get the small scale renewable projects, or sometimes also a bit larger, connected to the grid. There are rules that or regulatory frameworks that may not be very well adapted, but there are also endogenous barriers. So to a large extent, these communities rely on volunteering, so volunteer work by their members, and that's of course limited. So these members have jobs and maybe not the right competences. So there's a lack of professionalism, lack of time. Those are so those two components. Now, so as a result of these things, these offer some insights into explanations of why these renewable energy communities may not deliver the expected social benefits that they potentially could have. So barriers have been investigated, but there's been very little research, or no, that we know of, that focus on the identities of renewable energy communities, on social and organizational identities as another form of an endogenous barrier to scaling. So what we trying to investigate is whether social and organizational identity explain renewable energy communities' scaling orientation. So whether or not they want to scale, and in which way then. Okay, so here's the theoretical model. So the middle part, the REC scaling strategy, is what we would try to explain. On the left side, we say, okay, there's the members of the renewable energy communities that have their social identities, and their social identities is how they categorize themselves in the social context. And on the other side, there's the organizational identity, which is more of a collective identification of the organization. And so, and in the middle is the scaling. So let's start in the middle. So there we recognize 4 types of scaling strategies that come from we identified in literature. So there's scale up, so the traditional growing of the renewable energy community, or the renewable so going toward ever more renewable energy capacity and bigger projects, etc. There's scaling out, meaning to diversify their activities, and so not only say when they're in solar, they may expand to wind or energy efficiency, or some energy use advice, some non-technical services as well. So that's the second one. Scaling across, meaning to replicate the model, so from one place to the next, into next, a bit of a proliferation of renewable energy communities, and scaling deep. That's more internally focused, improving internal processes to better to have better operations. Now, on the organizational identity side, we say that okay, it's defined as collective understanding of the features that are presumed to be central and relatively permanent. So this is about values of the organization, and so why do they exist and what do they try to accomplish, and the collective understanding of that. And the other side, there's the social identity. So this is more of an individual level thing, and here we use a specific kind of social identity, and that's the social identity typology that was produced by Fauschart and Gruber for founders of ventures, and they distinguish 3 types. So there's the Darwinians, the communitarians, and the missionaries. Now the Darwinians are the type that that see their organizations as well, profit-making vehicles for their self-interest. Communitarians are focused on the welfare of the community. They see their organization as a social object for the betterment of the community that they are part of. And missionaries see their organization more as a political object, so as a thing to forward a cause that is to the benefit of society at large. Right. Okay. Now, so the relation between organizational identity and renewable energy community scaling works in 2 ways. So first, there's the mechanism via the perceived identity gap. So if there's the organizational identity doesn't match what is needed according to in the context, so to operate or survive in the context. If there's the organization needs to change to adapt, and then okay, the way it needs to change, is the extent to which change is required. So change in organizational identity to adapt to the context may have an effect on whether or not scaling is or scaling up is well, whether or not action is taken actually. So if this identity gap is too large, then well, the organization may feel, okay, this is going to lose our organizational identity, so we may not. If it's too small, then there's no need to change. And if it's somewhere in between, there may be an incentive to for the organization to adapt its organizational identity. So this may work through the scaling strategies that they prefer. On the other hand, there's another mechanism. So there's the current organizational identity, and there's the ideal organizational identity as perceived by the members. Now, if there's a gap between that, so if there's an inconsistency of what the organization is and what its members want it to be, you can say that it could be perceived inconsistency. If there's an inconsistency, there's a tension driving action to close that, or to close that inconsistency. All right, and on the other side, there's the member's social identity. Now, the social identities is there's many members, so there's many social identities, but we say, okay, well, there's a mechanism that makes that most members have a similar social identity, because there's a social identity mechanism at play in the self-selection of members into the renewable energy community as a member. So there's the decision to join is basically like a comparison between an individual social identity and the dominant social identities in the renewable energy community. Okay, so this brings us to let's say four hypotheses. So first, there's on the left side. So okay, who is going to join the renewable energy community? Second, okay, given the social identities in the renewable energy communities, how it's going to affect scaling? And third, okay, the two mechanisms through which organizational identity may affect the scaling strategy. Now I'm going to skip these because they come later again. So for this study, we collected data from French renewable energy communities. So we did a survey among them and asked them, the members of the communities, for their motivation to join, their involvement in the community and the role they play in the community, also about their views on the community. And so what, according to them, are the values of the renewable energy community, what is their main mission, and what kind of expectations and priorities do they have for their community. And of course, some demographic questions about their personal characteristics. So we collected 255 responses from renewable energy communities from 73 communities. Now, as you can see here on the right, so there are many communities that are included from which we have only one response, so one member. And on the left side, you see there are a few communities, say 4 or 5, from which we have well, more than 10, close to 20 responses per community. So what we did in our study is to combine all these responses and say, okay, this is we are talking about renewable energy community as one organization, and you'll see why we think this is allowed, because there's lots of homogeneity across these communities as well. So we have responses on the individual level, and we look at the collective as one unit as well. Now, if we look in France, so these 73 communities are a considerable part of the 206 communities that are currently in France. Now, in these 206 communities, there are about 70,000 members who manage like 400 megawatts of installed capacity. Now, this is small. This is less than 1% of the installed renewable energy capacity in France, including hydro, I should say. Good. So if you look at our sample, there's a lots of homogeneity in that sample in terms of demographic characteristics. So first of all, most of the respondents are men. Only a bit over a quarter are women. And if you look at the age groups, well, here you see most are between 36 and 65, so a bit of a mature kind of demographic. And so few younger professionals, like 26 to 35 years, so starters in life, you could say, are a bit underrepresented. And if you look at the educational degrees, you see more than half are at the master's level. So it's a very highly educated demographic. It also consists largely of homeowners. And some other statistics. So 63% of them live in a house as opposed to an apartment or a duplex home. Why is it not okay? Up, okay. Yeah, 2/3 live in a town with less than 20,000 inhabitants. So it's a largely rural or small town phenomenon. And 17% are or were city council members. So that's a pretty large share of these members. You could say these city council members are more involved in their community, but it's also the ones that are, it's also where it often germinates the initiative of a renewable energy community. So it's a rather homogeneous population of older, highly educated men in small towns. Now, if you look at the first hypothesis, we stated that the more an individual feels his social identity is close to the group, the more the individual will be inclined to join the group. Now, we only have actual members in the sample, so that already decided to join. So it's hard to test, but we can find some indications if we look at the homogeneity of the members in terms of social groups, and so which we just saw in the previous slides. We can also look at the motivations to join the renewable energy community, and that the members say the reasons for why they joined, and also what they the reasons are they think for which others joined the renewable energy community. Now that's what we did on the next slide. So we asked members to choose like 3 reasons for why they joined the community, and also 3 reasons for why they thought other members in their community joined the community. You see the blue is their own reasons, and the orange are the others' reasons. And you see there's a bit of a similar distribution, or quite similar across the different reasons. And the ones that stand out are at the top. You can see most or pretty much all checked that they favor local and socially responsible energy production, and that's why they joined. And the second place is for mitigating global warming, and then there's creating an alternative to fossil fuels and creating an alternative to nuclear energy as the 4 most important ones, and the others are much less important. So it's about local energy production and energy transition, if you will. And they think that others joined largely for the same reasons. There are 2 discrepancies here. So taking action at the local level, that's less of reasons for why they joined themselves, but they think others joined for that reason more often. And creating an alternative to fossil fuels is prime reason for themselves, and less. They think that's lesser reasons for others. Okay, now this similarity, if you look at the individual level, you see on average there's 1.7 reasons that they have in common with the others. And that's what they say themselves. 1.7 out of 3 that they could have in common at most. Okay, so there's similarity there. I don't know, I'm not sure how we can, if that's there's no test to be made whether that's enough to support the hypothesis, but it's an indication that that there's some mechanism of homogeneity going on. Another thing we could do is to regress the core membership on social characteristics. So we divide the sample in members who are core and were more active and more engaged in the community, and social characteristics. And then we see, okay, men, although they're already a large share of the membership, they're even a larger share in the among the core members. There's also a larger share of master's degrees among the core members, and the unemployed relative to the employed are also more present among the core members. Now, this is so you can say, okay, some 2 features of this rather that are rather peculiar for the entire memberships are even more salient in the core members. So that's the gender and the level of education. So in a sense, yeah, it's even more homogeneous in the core membership, which you could say, okay, this could be an indication of a social identity confirming a mechanism. Now, yes, the rest I'm going to skip. We'll talk about it later. Now, in the second hypothesis, we were looking at the relation between social identity and scaling strategies. Now, in the social identities, we had 3 types: Darwinians, communitarians, and missionaries. Now, if you look at the sample and the distribution across these types, you see there's largely consists of communitarians and missionaries, and very few, only a bit over 6%, are Darwinians. Now, we coded these identities based on the motivations for why they joined. And you see, okay, so the very few joined for economic self-interested reasons. Mostly are focused on community benefit or social benefit for mostly advancing energy transition.
5 minutes, Mark.
All right, okay. Thanks. Right, so here we have the hypotheses that we linked. So for each social identity type, we hypothesized a certain scaling preference. And so for Darwinians who are more focused on economic efficiency and utility maximization, and they would focus on scale up and scale out strategies to become more efficient and increase the profitability. Communitarians, and they focus on scale deep strategies, so really on themselves and the betterment of their own. And missionaries are like activists, and they want to scale across, so replicate the model to other places and scale up to have a larger impact on the energy transition. So those are our hypotheses. Now, okay, then,
excuse me, Mark, you're
yes,
just already ahead of time, so if you can try to just keep our schedule. I mean, we have plenty of time, so you can just take 5 more minutes if you wish.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. All right. Now, so we had to sorry. Okay, we had to find ways to measure the scale up. Now we find those in the expectations that people have for their communities, and there are a few there that refer to scaling types. And so undertaking new projects or serving as a model, it's clear that's clear in scaling across type, and changing scale is really a strong scale up preference. Now, in the others, expectations have nothing to do with scaling. So we group those. And we could also see it in the priorities that they think their community should have. So there are a few scale out options that diversifying in different ways, that through different technologies, different activities, or awareness raising, improving internal procedures, and it's a scale deep form, and collaborating with professional developers in developing projects that suggests a scale up priority. Now that one is a bit low on the priority scales, as you can see. Now, and so I have to wrap up a little bit, so I'm gonna skip this. So here we ran, so to sum up, we ran some multinomial logarithm regressions and ordered logarithms with these dependent variables that we just saw to see scaling preferences. Now, we do not find any evidence that social identity affects shows a preference for different scaling options, but we do find that core members, so those are more engaged in their community, are less likely to expect scaling across. So that's the most important one. So they're less likely to say, okay, that their community should be an example for other communities to be started. And so core members are more focused on their own communities. So I'm going to move right to the conclusions then. Yeah. Okay. So no, I take this one.
Mark, just 1 minute. You need to conclude.
Okay, I need to conclude. Yeah. So core members are more focused on their own community. So, and as you can see, the values and the missions that they have for the community are also quite consistent, in that they consist of 2 components, and that is well, driving the it's energy transition, so producing alternative energies, and citizen involvement in that. So these 2 components would make up the organizational identity of renewable energy communities in France. So it's really a locally oriented communities. In that sense, okay, they can see, okay, they are successful. So if you look at the local level, they do have an impact on the energy transition, so on where they live. But it's also this local focus may be a barrier for them to diffuse and have impact on energy transitions in many other localities around the country. So what we're still thinking and but not have fully confirmed, is that membership homogeneity, as we observed in our renewable energy communities, is fostering organizational identity lock-in, and therefore becoming a barrier to renewable energy community scale-up and diffusion. So that is the last thing I will explain. That. All right. Now I hope you can enjoy this study in more detail in not too long time in some journal somewhere. All right. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Mark. Does
Thank
anyone have any question?
I have one, if I may start. I was wondering, did you observe, or could you measure in a more homogeneous communities if it's more likely to have phenomena like crowdfunding, or at least shared investment in like local solar panels or local wind turbines, for instance? For instance, I've seen in Denmark that citizens are really committed and invested in in the decision process to put some renewable capacities nearby. And do you have the same kind of phenomenon in France?
So are you asking whether the communities that are more homogeneous are more likely to have an energy community? Is it more or less like that?
Yes.
Well, we didn't test that, but it looks like it. So we have, as you can see, the membership is quite homogeneous. So you would say, okay, there's a quite rural or a small town, highly educated. So you could say, okay, small towns where there's more, you can expect more homogeneity in terms of demographics there. And apparently that's where these communities are. So it suggests, I think you can have an argument for a hypothesis that indeed more homogeneous towns are more likely to a more fertile ground for energy communities to arise. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other question?
May I?
Yes, please.
Okay. I have a question regarding the economic motives that you said that or you found out that it's absent or no important. Do you think about the reason? Are the culture, motivation, and the background of people, their intellectual level, their interest with environmental issues? What do you think about this? And I have another question. I don't understand the point perceived inconsistency on energy transition associated with the scaling up, but not for citizen involvement. If you can explain more this part.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the absence of economic motives, I think here it's largely due to the external context. So there's little support for decentralized renewable energy generation in France. So in the sense that there's no money to be made with investments in small solar or small wind. So all policy is geared towards larger projects. So there's a self-selection going on, and so into these communities as well. So that's one part. So they're not in there to make money. Second part is I think it's also the maybe also consequence of this homogeneous identity that is that the members are largely people who are that we also see it in Show It are either, well, a large part is it says to be quite competent in the energy sector, so it has affinity with energy. So yeah, so it's people who are more driven by normative motives to create an alternative, involve citizens, and they think that's a good thing to do. But you see in other papers that are in from other contexts, like Germany or Belgium, where economic motives do play a role, but those are the situations where a community is able to to provide some attractive investment proposition. Now, that's not the case in France. And your second question was about the inconsistency. Well, yeah. So we say, okay, well, some people join, say, okay, their community must live up to the value of having an impact on the energy transition. So that's an important value for them. And then we also ask them, okay, is your community impacting the energy transition? And then they say, no, I don't agree with that. So they don't think their energy community is impacting the energy transition, but they think it should. Okay, there's a gap between perceived reality and desired reality. And then you say, okay, how do you close this gap? Well, to have an impact on the energy transition, okay, you might need to do larger projects or more projects, right? So this is the reasoning behind that mechanism.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark, for your presentation. If you have a working paper, I would be interested by your work. The first paper is entitled Managing the Coal Transition for Workers in South Africa, a scenario analysis of age skills profile of the coal mining workforce. It's written by Jules Schers and Jess Burton and will be presented by Jules of University of Cape Town.
Is it working properly, Jules?
Yes, I'm sorry, the mute button changed
yes.
place in the screen once I started sharing my screen, so I had trouble unmuting. But here I am. Thank you very much for hosting me at the IAEE First Digital Conference. My topic is slightly different than that of the previous two presentations. Nevertheless, I hope it will be of interest to you. So this is a paper that I've written with my colleague Jessie Burton, and I have to apologize that it's still not finalized, but that will hopefully soon be the case. As some of you might know, South Africa is a country that on the one hand is quite engaged in sustainable questions of sustainable development, but on the other hand, it is also an economy that relies heavily on coal. Especially for its power generation, where more than 90% of electricity is produced from coal, and which it produces using its own domestic coal. And about 1/3 of South Africa's coal is,
I don't know
exported.
if it's only me, but I cannot hear you correctly.
Okay, shall I will try to speak a bit louder. Would that help?
Yeah, it's okay now.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Sorry. So so South Africa depends heavily on coal, and it exports. It's also a country that exports coal mainly to Asia. But of course, it wants it committed itself to the Paris Agreement and has is embarked on lowering the share of coal in power generation on the one hand, for which it also has good economic reasons, as renewable energy power generation options have now become the cheapest source for new power generation capacity in South Africa. And further analysis also shows that even within the energy sector, it would create more employment despite employment losses in coal mining. And the cheaper the impact on the electricity price, which would then be like lowering the electricity price, would have also bigger macroeconomic benefits, as Mervin et al. In Essay Tight Working Paper 84 outlined. Beyond the domestic factors influencing coal, there's also international developments, either through climate policy or just because of the market economics of renewable energy. South Africa's coal exports are mainly destined for Asia, with half of it, roughly half of it, going to India. And demand in these countries has not grown as it was expected about 7 to 8 years ago. Instead, demand has stayed flat in the last few years, and it's expected to remain flat or even decrease if renewable energy cost or climate policy will force the consumption of coal in Asia to either go down or to be or exports to be replaced by domestic production. So within South Africa itself, if we would just look at, suppose you would try to force coal into the energy system in the graph on the right, then what would happen is that it would mainly be a new coal mining region in the north of South Africa, the Waterberg region, which would develop, whereas the existing coal mining region, the Mpumalanga Highveld, will actually continue to see its coal output decline, as is also the case if you would do a rational least cost approach to power generation, as shown in the left graph. So, yeah, and in Mpumalanga, that's the province where coal mining is concentrated, meaning that, and especially 2 municipalities have a really high share of coal mining employment within the province, and therefore quite depend on it. Also, coal mining is one of the sectors that has been successfully appropriated by Black South Africans, whereas renewable energy, well, due to the blockages and other circumstances, has mainly been a private sector and mainly white owned or even foreign owned. So so there's the question of race and of public versus private energy that plays a role. And now, so the South African government knows that it has to provide solutions for the coal miners in order to have a political feasible energy transition. And so the International Labour Organization defines a just transition as a coherent policies across economic, environmental, social, educational, and labor portfolios needed to provide an enabling environment for enterprise, workers, investors, and consumers, and drive the transition towards environmentally sustainable and especially inclusive economies and societies. Another part of the ILO definition, which is important, is that it's about anticipating. And so to anticipate and to prepare policies for just transition in South Africa, one will have to know also what the characteristics are of coal miners. So in this study, we have tried to get a better picture of the coal miner characteristics, and we use that information to develop counterfactual scenarios for coal mining employment and to get an idea of what the solutions, what part of the coal mining labor force that would lose employment would fall into what kind of re-employment categories, and so what kind of solutions one might expect. And so what is important to signal in coal mining employment is that it's on average the age of workers in coal mining is similar to that of the entire workforce in South Africa, but it's more concentrated around the middle age group. So there's less younger workers than in other sectors, and there's less older workers relative to other sectors. The educational level of coal mining workers is similar to that of the South African average. And the salaries tend to be higher relative to the level of education, but they tend to work less long in coal mining on average. So the question is are there indeed less workers in coal mining at old age? And this is just a graphical impression, but in brown you see the age distribution of the people of working age between 16 and 64, and in black we see the age distribution of coal miners as measured in the PALMS data set between 2013 and 2017, and we notice that the share of older workers relative decreases faster than in relative to the average workforce. In other sectors in South Africa, here in purple blue, a bit the same is happening. So people just don't work till retirement age. Many people don't work till retirement age, but it's a bit less fast than in coal mining. And while there is a lot of documentation about environmental health for the communities and for water and land and air, due to coal mining pollution, occupational health of coal miners is something which unfortunately has not been published on a lot, but discussions with people working in coal mining and with people of the unions indicated that there are serious health, physical and health reasons for people to quit coal mining before retirement. So that probably limits the possibilities for what would be an inclusive just transition solution, like for instance in Spain, where a very early retirement was offered to all coal mining workers. So in prospective analysis that we did for this study, we tried to define how many people leave the coal mining workforce at age. And so here in the table, you see the percentages of the people leaving coal mining relative to the demographic development of what would be expected due to demographic development evolution in the labor force. And so basically what we see is that above 40 years old, you see a net decrease in employment. I didn't, from the labor force statistics, it's impossible to define the gross decrease. So we don't know how many people are newly hired at age 40 or older, but this is if we just look at the net decrease of people above 35, then we estimate that on a labor force of 80,000, about 80,000 workers, there's annually about 1,000 new hires, even if unemployment would stay constant. And now we explore two counterfactual scenarios for future employment in coal mining, for which we also assume that the labor productivity in coal mining will stay constant. So no shift to many small, more labor-intensive mines, so neither a shift to, which is more probable, to more mechanization and automatization in coal mining. And so in the red line, we see the evolution of employment under what would be a rational least cost energy system. And in the green line, we present an accelerated transition scenario, which was published by Ecole et al. In Acetite Working Paper 29 in 2019, and which brings South Africa closer to well below 2 degrees energy CO greenhouse gas emission pathway. And now we defined a few rule of thumb, we define a few categories about who would be employable or not. Just for your information, before the COVID-19 economic crisis, COVID-19 related economic crisis, official unemployment in South Africa stood at 28%, with if you include discouraged work seekers, that would increase to about 38-39% of the potential labor force. And now, since the COVID-19 crisis, the official unemployment rate has risen to 32%, if I recall correctly, and the discouraged work seekers unemployment to above 42%. I don't know the exact numbers. And so at these high unemployment rates, I can imagine that with little education, either being old or young, there's hardly any chance to find a job. But on the contrary, those who have a post-high school degree have a fairly good chance of finding a job compared to the average, which still means that they will struggle. So, and we use these categories of high to average to very low chance of finding a job to quantify how the employment chances of the former coal mining workforce would develop under the different scenarios. So as a reference, we first assumed that we decided to look at what happens if we assume constant employment in coal mining. So in the top row, you see the employment numbers for each 5-year period. So it stays around 75,000. Then there's retirements based on the demographic profile that I showed earlier, which in the beginning are around 1,000 person a year, and then go up to 2,000 towards the 2040s. Then there's the business as usual people leaving the workforce. Those are the people who leave coal mining employment over 40, but before the retirement age. And so for each 5-year period, that's about 6,000 to 11,000 people. So between 1,000 and 2,000 people a year between now and 2045. And of those, many would fall into the category of low to very low chance, or actually no chance at all of finding a new job. And a minor part would have an average to above average chance of finding a new job. And more importantly, all the retirements and the business and the people who leave the workforce would lead to a net hiring of under 40s of about also 1,000 to 2,000 persons a year in this period. Now, going to least cost, economically rational energy future, what we see is that employment decreases. So from the 75,000 people that would be working in 2018 in coal mining, the employment goes to a bit less than half in 2045. The employment that remains is mainly also to supply industry with coal for heating purposes, or for steel production, or for, in South Africa, coal to liquid fuel production. But of course, those coal uses could be expected to disappear if we move to a net zero economy by 2050. But yeah, we stick to to an analysis of the power sector, and so what we see is that so the employment decreases faster, and so there's more job losses, especially in the early years in 2020 to 2025 and 2021 to 2035. A few more job losses, a couple of hundreds per year, compared to the reference constant employment reference scenario. But what is most striking is that if we go for rational energy future, is that there are less new hires. So the business as usual dynamics of coal mining is mainly affected in the point where there's less people obtaining a new job in coal mining. Now, if we would go to an accelerated transition scenario, which would bring South Africa closer to respecting the Paris Agreement, again, only looking at the power sector role in that transition, then what we see is that additional job losses, so employment decreases a lot faster than in least cost energy future, power sector energy future, and so there's a significant amount of additional job losses of about in the beginning, especially in the early years now, about 2,000 coming 4 to 5 years, about 2,000 persons a year, which is significant on the about 75,000 people strong labor force. So that's so it's what we see is that it's a dynamic transition to a low carbon economy is something that plays out really in the coming decade, and not after 2030. And we see that those who are not re-employment, the distribution. So there's a lot of them, these additional job losses that will have fairly have a low to very low chance of finding a new job, but relatively speaking, we'll see more younger, more educated people so losing their jobs. So, but yet the proportion of people who will be struggling to find a new job is significant. Now, we did one analysis of what would happen if we would reduce the retirement age by 10 years, assuming that those who work could be transferred to the mines where work continues. And then what we see is that of course, the number of early retirements, the number of early retirements increases enormously. And this by about 2,000 persons a year in the 2020s. And so that really reduces the amount of people who would leave the workforce before retirement. And so the number of additional job losses for the accelerated transition scenario would be a lot lower, yet not completely avoided. And most importantly, we still do not obtain new hires in coal mining, of course. So, so from what do we learn from this analysis? So we learned that a just transition for coal mining in South Africa is not only about providing a solution to South African coal miners, but it's a lot also about developing new economic activity in the coal mining areas. So Campbell and Kunen in the coal transitions project have given recommendations for how such new economic development policies could be, how they should or could look like. So early retirement does reduce the problem, at least it improves the economic outlook for those currently in coal mining, but as we've seen, coal mining remains a relatively young labor force due to the high turnover, and so it's not a solution for all coal miners. And so yeah, retraining will be needed and possible for a part of the more younger and relatively educated labor force, relatively skilled. But of course, yeah, it doesn't still leaves a significant amount of people with neither early retirement and few hopes that retraining will lead to new jobs. So other measures will be needed. And so, of course, one could try to position renewables in the Mpumalanga area. It would cost, the capacity factor of renewables in Mpumalanga is only 9% below that of the best locations in South Africa for solar PV, which means that it's still way
5 minutes, Jules.
better. Okay, I'm almost there, thank you. And so it means that solar energy in Mpumalanga is still the capacity factors for solar energy in Mpumalanga are still much higher than, for instance, in Europe. And it would not make a big deal for the electricity price if solar would be in Mpumalanga, and it would have advantages of having the transition grid and having a relatively skilled labor force available compared to the more deserted areas in South Africa where you would have the best conditions for capacity factors. But of course, that would not be suitable for everybody either. Renewables seems to be a quite demanding, quite skilled labor force, and renewables will also develop in other locations than Mpumalanga. So yeah, more active, more policies, more measures, action is needed, and rather soon, as I've indicated above. Due to the age of coal power plants currently in use in South Africa, and a lot will have to take place. A lot of the change will take place in the next 10 years, and so solutions are quickly needed. And so the South African government is working on these solutions. It has established a committee for a just transition at the government level, but yeah, in some locations like the towns of Arno and Hendrina, well, the abandonment and unemployment and problems with mortgage, house loans, mortgages are already severely affecting people living there. So there's some urgencies, and above all, yeah, we need to plan for it. And one of the problems we ran into in this study is that the labor force surveys are actually the only, almost the only public complete data on the South African coal mining labor force, but the granularity is fairly low. And so it would help if more employment data from coal mining companies would be publicly available. So I thank you for your attention, and the floor is yours for questions.
Thank you, Jules. Does any have any question? Anyone have any question, please?
Maybe I have a small question. So you said it in your conclusion that it depends also on the capacity of the job market to accommodate the coal workers in other sectors. Did you take into account the future forecasted dynamics of the job sector in South Africa to quantify how many coal workers could move to other sectors? How exactly did you?
No, we have not quantified that aspect. As macroeconomists, we tend to work with the broad definition of unemployment, so the before crisis 38% unemployment rate, and even at relatively optimistic scenarios for South Africa's economic growth, we still see this broad unemployment rates at best going down from around 38 to around 20%. So that means that still a high level of unemployment will remain, and of course that, yeah, it would improve the possibilities of these workers. But on the other hand, you have the regional economic dynamics. So some towns, so there's 2 municipalities that highly depend on coal mining, and it's called thermal power plants. And what we see is that we also have people there who are like halfway paying their mortgages, and once the coal mines and the power plants cease to exist, yeah, if there's no new economic development stimulated in some way, then these towns will either become ghost towns, or people will be locked in poverty because they can't leave their house either. So yeah, of course, there are possibilities to develop new economic activities in this region. I think it's one of the regions that is best connected to South Africa's ports in terms of railway infrastructure. As I mentioned, the coal mine labor force is a labor force with technical skills that are interesting to other sectors, but I guess it needs some active policies to envision and to organize, for instance, new economic activities, probably some reskilling and training, and probably some more community-focused activities on trying to develop take advantage of the strengths of these regions to and to stimulate people to develop maybe businesses. But yeah, the main point is that the province of Mpumalanga is fairly is engaged in developing these activities, but everything is running late and so to say, compared to the timelines that I just outlined, and that probably also needs public investment, as it also happened in other countries like the Netherlands or Germany, where some relatively successful coal phase outs have taken place in the past.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much for our presenter. The session has finished, so we can go to the other session.
Yes, don't forget to upload your presentations on your dashboard once again, just before leaving or going to other stuff.
Thank you very much for hosting
Thank you
us.
again for your presentations. It was all very interesting.
Yes, thank you for hosting.
Thank you.
I'll upload my presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, I stopped the recording.